What prison life is really like in Canada, harsh truth. The illusion of a kinder prison system. Canada's reputation versus reality. Canada is often described as a gentler place, a country known globally for politeness, social welfare, and progressive criminal justice reform. In international comparisons, Canadian prisons are frequently portrayed as more humane than those in the United States. Fewer executions. No life without parole for most crimes. Greater emphasis on rehabilitation. But inside the walls of Canada's prisons, that image tells only part of the story. Behind the clean statistics and carefully worded government language exists a system shaped by isolation, psychological pressure, institutional violence, and long-term damage that rarely makes headlines. This documentary is not about myths. It is about what prison life in Canada is actually like, based only on verifiable facts, official reports, court findings, and first-hand documentation. And for many incarcerated people, the harsh truth is this. Canadian prison may look calmer from the outside, but for those inside, it can be just as punishing, and sometimes more quietly destructive. Before we continue, if you value deeply researched, factual prison documentaries that go beyond surface-level narratives, support Life Behind Bars by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support directly helps us continue producing long-form investigations like this. Stories grounded in evidence, not exaggeration, stories most people never see. Now, let's go inside. Who runs Canadian prisons? Canada's prison system is divided into two main levels. Federal prisons are operated by Correctional Service Canada, commonly referred to as CSC. These institutions house individuals serving sentences of 2 years or more. Provincial and territorial jails are run by individual provinces and territories. They hold people serving sentences under 2 years, as well as those awaiting trial or sentencing. As of the most recent publicly available data, Canada incarcerates tens of thousands of people at any given time. While its incarceration rate is significantly lower than that of the United States, it remains higher than most Western European countries. The difference is not simply how many people are imprisoned, but how imprisonment is experienced. And in Canada, that experience depends heavily on one thing: security levels, where life changes fast. Every federally incarcerated person in Canada is classified into one of 3 security levels: minimum security, medium security, maximum security. This classification determines nearly every aspect of daily life: movement, contact with others, access to programs, and time spent in cells. The assessment is based on factors such as criminal history, institutional behavior, and perceived escape risk. However, multiple oversight bodies have found that these classifications are not always stable or predictable. People can be moved to higher security levels based on internal incidents, allegations, or administrative decisions, sometimes without criminal charges. Once placed in higher security, daily life narrows. And in maximum security, the environment becomes intensely controlled. Daily confinement: how much time is spent locked in. In many Canadian federal institutions, especially at medium and maximum security levels, incarcerated people can spend 20 to 22 hours per day inside their cells. This is not officially labeled as solitary confinement in most cases. Instead, it is described administratively as cell confinement, restricted movement, or lockdown conditions. But oversight agencies, including Canada's own correctional investigator, have repeatedly warned that prolonged confinement, regardless of terminology, carries serious psychological risks. The difference between isolation and incarceration becomes blurred. And for some individuals, these conditions can persist for weeks or months. The end of solitary confinement. On paper. In 2019, Canada officially ended the use of administrative segregation, following multiple court rulings that found it unconstitutional when used for extended periods. In its place, CSC introduced what are called structured intervention units, or SIUs. The promise was clear. More time out of cells. More access to mental health care. More human contact. However, subsequent reports from independent watchdogs and civil rights organizations have stated that, in practice, SIUs often mirror the same conditions segregation was supposed to eliminate. In some cases, incarcerated individuals still spent over 20 hours per day locked alone. The name changed. The experience often did not. Mental health inside Canadian prisons. Mental health is one of the most documented crisis points in Canada's prison system. A significant portion of the incarcerated population enters custody with pre-existing mental health conditions. Others develop symptoms after prolonged exposure to confinement, stress, and institutional control. Official reports have repeatedly identified high rates of depression, anxiety disorders, self-harm incidents, suicidal ideation. Indigenous and Black incarcerated individuals are disproportionately affected, a pattern acknowledged in multiple federal reviews. Despite policy commitments to care, access to consistent psychiatric treatment varies widely between institutions. And in some cases, individuals experiencing mental health crises have been placed in more restrictive environments, not less. Violence behind the walls. Compared to some other countries, Canada's prisons report lower rates of homicide. But violence still exists, often in less visible forms. Assaults between incarcerated individuals occur regularly, particularly in overcrowded or understaffed institutions. There have also been documented cases of excessive use of force by correctional staff, investigated by external oversight bodies. These incidents rarely resemble chaotic riots. Instead, violence in Canadian prisons is often quiet, sudden, and controlled, happening behind closed doors, out of public view. Indigenous overrepresentation. One of the most troubling realities of Canada's prison system is the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples. Although Indigenous people make up a small percentage of Canada's overall population, they represent a disproportionately large share of the federal prison population. This disparity has been acknowledged repeatedly by the Canadian government, courts, and correctional authorities. Factors cited include intergenerational trauma, socioeconomic marginalization, systemic bias within the justice system. Despite legal frameworks intended to reduce Indigenous incarceration, the numbers have continued to rise in recent years. For many, prison becomes not a temporary consequence, but a recurring presence across generations. Food, healthcare, and the cost of survival. Food behind the walls, not hunger, but control. Food in Canadian federal prisons is not designed to starve people. On paper, meals must meet nationally approved nutritional standards. Menus are centrally planned, portioned, and cost-controlled by Correctional Service Canada. But what looks adequate on a spreadsheet often feels very different inside a cell. In 2014, CSC introduced a centralized food services model, replacing on-site cooking in many institutions with pre-cooked or bulk-prepared meals designed to reduce costs. According to internal reports and subsequent investigations, the change reduced food budgets significantly. What followed were widespread complaints from incarcerated people across the country. Not about luxury, but about quantity, quality, and dignity. What prisoners actually eat. Meals in Canadian prisons typically consist of processed meats, starches such as rice or potatoes, boiled or steamed vegetables, limited fresh fruit, special diets. Religious, medical, or cultural, are technically available, but access can be inconsistent depending on institution and staffing levels. Multiple reports from oversight bodies have noted that food complaints increased sharply after centralization. Some incarcerated individuals reported weight loss. Others reported constant hunger. CSC has stated publicly that meals meet nutritional requirements, and independent audits have confirmed caloric adequacy on paper. However, the lived experience remains a point of contention. Food, in prison, is not just nourishment. It is routine. It is control. And it is often one of the few daily markers of time. The prison canteen economy. When regular meals feel insufficient, many incarcerated people rely on the canteen, also known as commissary. This is where they can purchase additional food items. Instant noodles. Canned tuna or sardines. Cookies and snacks. Coffee and sugar. But access depends on money. And in Canadian prisons, wages for prison labor are extremely low. After mandatory deductions for room and board, phone usage, and other fees, many incarcerated people are left with only a few dollars per day, sometimes less. For those without family support on the outside, hunger becomes an ongoing concern. Healthcare, a legal right with limits. Healthcare in Canadian prisons is, by law, a constitutional obligation. Incarcerated individuals are entitled to a standard of care comparable to what is available in the community. And yet, multiple official investigations have found serious gaps. Common issues include long wait times for specialist care, limited access to mental health professionals, inconsistent continuity of treatment, over-reliance on medication instead of therapy. In remote institutions, access to outside hospitals requires transport, security clearance, and staffing, all of which can cause delays. In non-emergency cases, treatment can take weeks or months to materialize. Mental health care, where the system strains. Mental health care remains one of the most criticized aspects of Canadian corrections. Despite policy commitments, Canada's correctional investigator has repeatedly warned that demand far exceeds capacity. In some institutions, psychologists are responsible for hundreds of patients. Sessions are brief and infrequent. Crisis responses default to confinement rather than care. Self-harm incidents and suicide attempts remain a persistent issue across the federal system. Deaths by suicide in custody have been officially documented and investigated, though not all details are always made public. In several cases, coroners have found systemic failures, not individual mistakes, as contributing factors. Medication and restraints. Medication is one of the primary tools used to manage mental illness in prison. Antidepressants, antipsychotics, and sedatives are commonly prescribed. While medication can be essential, critics argue that it is sometimes used as a substitute for comprehensive care. In extreme cases, incarcerated individuals experiencing mental health crises have been placed in physical restraints or isolated environments. These practices are subject to strict rules and reporting requirements. But investigations have shown they are not always applied consistently. Aging and illness behind bars. Canada's prison population is aging. Longer sentences, combined with limited parole access for some offenses, mean more people are growing old, and sick, behind bars. Chronic illnesses such as diabetes, heart disease, and mobility impairments are increasingly common. While some institutions have specialized units, many were not designed to accommodate elderly or disabled populations. As a result, basic daily tasks can become exhausting, and sometimes dangerous. Death in custody. Deaths in Canadian prisons do occur. They include natural causes, suicides, drug overdoses, medical complications. Every death in custody triggers a formal review process. However, families and advocacy groups have often criticized the lack of transparency surrounding these investigations. In some cases, recommendations are made, but not fully implemented. For those inside, death is not abstract. It is something that happens in neighboring cells. Sometimes without warning. Drugs inside Canadian prisons. Despite security measures, drugs are present in Canadian prisons. This is not speculation. It is acknowledged in official reports. Common substances include opioids, stimulants, prescription drugs diverted from medical use. Overdoses have occurred in custody, prompting harm reduction measures such as overdose response training and, in some institutions, pilot programs involving supervised consumption tools. These measures have sparked national debate, praised by some as life-saving, criticized by others as contradictory. The pressure builds. Food that barely satisfies. Healthcare that exists, but often arrives late. Mental health systems stretched thin. Aging bodies confined in buildings never meant to hold them. This is the daily reality for many people incarcerated in Canada. And yet, the system is not finished exerting pressure. Staff, lockdowns, release. And what prison in Canada really means. The people in between, correctional officers. Any honest look at prison life in Canada must also include the people tasked with running these institutions. Correctional officers operate under constant pressure. Official reports from Correctional Service Canada and federal unions have repeatedly documented chronic understaffing, mandatory overtime, high rates of burnout and PTSD, increased assaults on staff. Many officers work double shifts, often in volatile environments where tension can change instantly. This strain matters, because when staffing drops, control methods change. Lockdowns, order through confinement. When staffing levels are too low, Canadian prisons often resort to institution-wide lockdowns. During a lockdown, incarcerated people remain in their cells for most or all of the day. Programs are cancelled. Visits are suspended. Showers and phone access are limited. Lockdowns are officially described as temporary safety measures. But internal data and watchdog reports show that some institutions experience lockdown conditions frequently, sometimes for days or weeks at a time. The result is prolonged isolation, not as punishment, but as policy. Programs, rehabilitation with limits. Canada's correctional system emphasizes rehabilitation in principle. Federal prisons offer programs aimed at substance abuse treatment, anger management, education and literacy, employment skills. Completion of these programs can affect parole eligibility. However, access is uneven. Waitlists are long. Programs are often cancelled due to staffing shortages. Lockdowns interrupt progress without warning. In some cases, individuals are denied parole for not completing programs they could not access in time. The system expects change, but does not always provide the conditions to achieve it. Parole, freedom with strings attached. Most federally incarcerated people in Canada are eligible for parole. But parole is not automatic. It requires approval from the Parole Board of Canada, based on risk assessments, institutional behavior, and program participation. Even when parole is granted, conditions are strict. Curfews. Mandatory reporting. Geographic restrictions. Substance prohibitions. A technical violation, not a new crime, can result in immediate return to custody. For many, freedom remains fragile. Release without support. Re-entry is one of the least visible but most critical stages of incarceration. Many people leave prison with limited savings, no stable housing, gaps in healthcare, few employment prospects. While some support services exist, coverage is inconsistent across regions. Indigenous, Black, and mentally ill individuals face especially high barriers upon release, a reality acknowledged in federal reviews. Without support, the risk of reoffending increases. And the cycle continues. Life sentences and the long view. Canada does not impose life without parole in most cases. But life sentences still exist. For those serving them, prison becomes not a phase, but a permanent environment. Years pass measured by routines, lockdowns, and institutional reviews. For some, hope becomes procedural rather than emotional. The harsh truth, without myth. So what is prison life really like in Canada? It is not the brutal spectacle seen elsewhere. But it is also not gentle. It is a system that relies heavily on confinement to manage scarcity. A system where isolation can exist without the name solitary. Where care is promised, but delayed. Where rehabilitation is encouraged, but often interrupted. Where harm is rarely loud, but frequently lasting. Canada's prison system reflects the country itself, cautious, regulated, and deeply conflicted. It strives for humanity. Yet often falls short in practice. And until the realities behind the walls are fully acknowledged, not softened by comparison, the harsh truth remains unchanged. This has been Life Behind Bars. If you believe factual, in-depth documentaries matter, stories built on evidence, not exaggeration, support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. Because the stories that happen behind these walls don't end when the gates close. They just disappear from view.